Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we have round 3 of the competition, featuring the incredibly talented Raven Reads. So I hope you enjoy tonight's narrations. When you're done, don't forget to check out her channel, which can be found in the end cards and in the description. But anyway, for now it's time for you all to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened when I was a kid, about 12 years ago. My family and I lived in the back bayous of South Louisiana, and we didn't have a lot of neighbours. So there were long stretches of woods and water with no people around. One day, my best friend and I were playing between our houses. They were about 1.5 miles apart, and we were walking on the main road, which was really a single-lane gravel road, when a large red truck with huge tyres and a double-extended cab comes rolling down the road. We knew he wasn't local, because there were only a handful of people living back there, and we knew them and their vehicles by sight. The truck slowed as it reached us, and we were smart enough to back up away from the road, out of arm's reach. The man in the truck was your typical redneck, mullet, scraggly beard, wife-beater and jeans, but he seemed friendly enough as he explained that he was lost and looking for the way back towards town, since getting lost in the depths of the Louisiana bayou happens more often than you'd imagine. We didn't think much of it. Politely, but from a distance, we gave him directions back towards town. He thanked us, drove off around a curb, and we continued walking. Suddenly we hear the sound of a truck spinning out on the gravel road and revving its engines. We looked at each other, and then heard the crunch of tyres coming at us quickly. We broke into an all-out run at top speed. We rounded another curve, and there we saw the wooden bridge that followed over the bayou channel. Without hesitation, we dove over this side and crawled up under the bridge, where it nearly met with the road, huddling as tightly as we could, ignoring the spiders and ants that we were disturbing. The truck came, roared up and got over the bridge, and then turned around and came back. The man stopped on the bridge and got out, coming to stand by the railings. He then walked the length of the bridge on both sides, frequently looking over the edges, and stopped to peer between the slats of the bridge. Fortunately, we were deep into the shadows, so he wouldn't have been able to see us without physically climbing down. He spit, swore, got into his truck and drove off. We waited for a long time before we crawled out from under that bridge. To this day, I'm convinced he had very bad intentions.
My middle school was walking distance from my house, 2 to 3 blocks at most. School ended at 3:15, and my mom didn't get home until 4, so it just made sense for me to walk home every day. One day, I was on my way home after class, as usual. This was 6th grade, so I was either 10 or 11 years old. I can't remember exactly at this point. In any case, it was a nice, normal day for most of the walk. I was most of the way down my block, only 4 or 5 houses away from my own, when a green pickup truck pulled up on the street near me. The truck was facing the opposite direction I was, pointed away from the direction in which I was walking. A man rolled down his window and called for my attention in a friendly manner. "Hey there." I was a little confused, but I said, "Hi," back to him. I stopped where I was, but I didn't go closer to the truck. He continued, "Hey, I'm trying to find my dog. Have you seen him?" "No," I replied. "Ah, darn. Well, hey, I have a picture of him. Can I show it to you? Maybe you can keep an eye out for me." Now, I wasn't the brightest kid, but man, I must have had some wit in me. I don't remember where, but I had definitely heard this story before. and I knew that it was a trick. No, that's okay. Sorry, I have to go. He responded one more time. Oh, are you sure? It'd really help me out. Yeah, I'm sure it would, bud. No, thank you. I walked home, not totally freaked out, but definitely knowing that something was weird. I walked inside, locked the doors, and called my mom at work. She was already on her way home from work, according to the person who picked up at her store. She got home, and I told her what happened. I'll be honest, I don't remember what happened from there. All I know is from that day on, I would walk to the library after school, which was right next to my school, until my mom would pick me up. Looking back on it, I think at the time I had heard so much about kidnapping and murders on television, in school assemblies, and so on, that my reaction probably amounted to, oh, okay, this is one of those things that always happens to people. Don't go talk to the man, just go home. That's what they told me to do. That's probably why I don't remember too much of the details after that happened. It was weird, but it didn't terrorize me. It wasn't until a few years ago that I put everything together. That my entire innocence, or even my life, could have ended right then and there on that day. Fucking A+ to stranger danger awareness on this one. In any case, pickup truck man with the missing dog, let's not meet.
I used to live in a very small town that was predominantly safe for kids. It only had some drug issues. Anyway, my house was located in a small and upscale part of the town, which mainly housed families. There was a small pond with lots of green in the neighborhood that was about a 5-minute walk from my house. To get to the pond, you had to go down a grass hill. Neighborhood kids, including myself, would always go down to the pond for hours to catch frogs, skip rocks, etc. So now to the story. On this particular day, it was raining and pretty cold, so there were no other kids at the pond. My best friend and her brother, who was 1 year older than us, and myself, decided to head down to the pond for a bit. After about half an hour, we see that at the top of the hill, a minivan pulls up. We thought nothing of it, as there was a neighborhood mailbox at the top of this hill, and we thought lots of people stopped to get their mail. A man started to get out of the minivan, and I remember him being older, probably in his 60s. Another note, since we live in such a small town, everyone knows everyone, or could at least recognize everyone. I remember thinking it was strange that I had never seen this man before in town or in the neighborhood. He got out and just stared at the three of us for what seemed to be forever. All of a sudden he yelled at us, "It's not safe down there. You kids better come up here." My best friend and her brother looked terrified, and I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. We didn't say anything back, and he continued to repeat that phrase. "It's not safe down there. You kids better come up here." Our fight or flight reaction kicked in, and we all booked it to the other side of the hill, which was only about a few meters away from him and the minivan. As soon as he saw us running, he got into his minivan and started driving slowly behind us, literally following us until we reached my house. Luckily, my garage door was open, and my parents' 2 cars were parked inside. We hid behind one of my parents' cars and watched as he pulled to the side of the house and parked. My parents were inside, but obviously had no idea what was happening. He stayed parked in front of my house for a few minutes, until my dad came outside to take the trash out, and saw the 3 of us were hiding. I guess the man saw my dad and drove away. But as soon as he left, we told my parents everything. Even until this day, 12 years later, my parents still think we were being overdramatic, and that it was a man that was genuinely concerned for our safety, because of the weather. But nonetheless, we weren't allowed to go back to the pond anymore. I don't blame them for thinking this though, as the three of us tended to be a bit dramatic and get worked up easily. But I knew, from the way I had a strange feeling when I first saw him at the top of the hill, that something was off, and to this day, I believe that man was planning something.
My coworker, I will call her Jane, is 33 years old, a virgin, and a very devout Christian. Her family is very strict and very religious. I'm not bashing the religion in any way. I was raised a Christian myself. These people, though, they just seem to take their beliefs to a new extreme. Think of them as the Flanders from The Simpsons. I mention that Jane is a virgin because she has honestly never even had a boyfriend before. She's been on a few dating websites as of late, but she's usually very strict when it comes to the types of guys that she would date. She can be kind of stuck up, which has gained her very little popularity. She recently met a guy on OkCupid. Let's call him Miguel. Miguel claims to live in a bigger city than ours, about an hour away. We are in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and says that he is 35 years old, also claims to be a virgin, and takes an interest in Jane. They chat for a while, and she's very excited. Once they establish a fondness for each other, he claims that he has $250,000 in savings and a job at Cessna that pays $65 an hour. He has a nice apartment and 2 cars, one of which is a '69 Dodge Charger. Sounds too good to be true, right? Yeah, we all agreed. Well, everyone but her. They agree to meet for a first date, and he says he'll drive down here to see her. While driving down, he claims to get into an accident on the interstate and is left hospitalized. Jane is devastated, but the rest of us all just assumed that he was lying to her and that this was his way of getting out of the date and her finding out that he was scum. We didn't think there would be any more communication afterwards. We were wrong. They continued talking, and shortly after getting out of the hospital, he claimed he was hit by a car crossing the street. His life apparently took a turn for the worst, as he claimed he was laid off from Cessna, his apartment was burglarized, and all of his money and his other car were seized by the IRS due to a misunderstanding on his taxes a few years back. Completely believable stories, right? Much to our dismay, Jane decides she doesn't care about these things, and she's willing to continue talking to the man. He soon starts calling her daily and coming over once a week to visit her at work. Now, at this point, we get to meet the guy, and he comes off as your typical loser with a beer belly who lays around on the couch all day, yelling at his woman to bring him a beer. Despite all of the money he claims to have, he wears clothes that are way too big for him, usually sweatpants and flip-flops. This earned him the name Flip-Flops amongst those of us at work. He has problems making eye contact with people when he talks to them, and he has the creepiest smile. We just know right away that he doesn't seem very trustworthy. The first time I met Miguel, it was on freight day at work. We all work in a retail store. Jane and the rest of her department had just finished their freight, and they were allowed to go home for the day. I grumbled as I worked in the department next to them and had to finish my freight by myself. I work right next to the time clock, so I saw Jane clock out. About 10 minutes later, a guy shows up in sweatpants and flip-flops. He smiles creepily at me as he wanders around her department. I continue putting up my freight. He walks up to me and hands me a Pepsi. "Can you give this to Jane, please?" "Oh, sorry, dude. She just clocked out for the day." "What?" His face dropped as he darted to the front door. I shrugged it off and continued working. A few minutes later, he comes back slightly flustered. "Her car is still out there. She's still here." I gave him a funny look and stated that I saw her clock out. He stormed off again. A few more moments later, he returns, furious. "Her car is out there. Where is she?" Now, I was a bit alarmed. Jane is pretty large, so I thought to myself it was probably taking her that long to get across the store. "Do I need to get a manager on you?" he shouted. "Where is Jane?" Fortunately for me, my boyfriend showed up at about that time. He expected that I would get off at the same time as the rest of my coworkers, so he came in trying to find out where I was. "Oh, did you say Jane?" he said. "I just saw her in the parking lot." Flip-Flop stormed out as my boyfriend and I gave each other a "what the fuck" look. 3 weeks into their relationship, which ended up being the morning after this incident, Miguel showed up at our work and proposed to Jane. She gladly agreed, as we all shook our heads in disbelief. My boyfriend laughed when I told him this, and he wasn't surprised that Jane was, quote, dating that Neanderthal. Looking back on it now, I think the fact that Jane could slip through this guy's grasp and actually do something unnoticed by him freaked him out. He didn't have as much control as he wanted. That might have instigated this proposal, making him want to make sure that he had complete control over her, which is a terrifying thought. After this proposal, he tells us he got a new job working for Microsoft in his city. We did our research. There are no Microsoft jobs over there. I mean, unless you're working and selling their products at Best Buy. And he tells her that he's now seeing a therapist for his anger and jealousy issues. Many red flags are going off in our heads at this point, but Jane doesn't seem to mind any of it. He moves down here to be with her after claiming that his family disowned him for wanting to marry a Christian. He claims they're all devoted Catholics, and that's the reason why she'll never get to meet them. As if this isn't ridiculous and over the top enough, things start to get even creepier from here. He tells us that he has a new job for $25 an hour as the head engineer at Exide Manufacturing. Now, the head of HR at Exide is actually a relative of a friend of ours, so we ask her about this. They've never heard of this man, and what's more, the position he claims he has doesn't exist. We try to tell Jane about it, but she brushes off all of our comments and claims that we're just thinking too much about it, or we're jealous. He starts to pick her up and drop her off from work every single day, as well as picking her up for all of her lunches. She still believes he has a full-time job and that he's only doing this because of how much he loves her. We start to feel that he's just wanting to know where she is at all times. He asks the maintenance man at our work, after their very first meeting, to be the best man at his wedding. This doesn't strike Jane as odd because apparently Miguel is untrusting of most people and has no friends of his own because they all want him for his money. Her parents loan him their spare van so he can use that to drive from now on. To our shock, her parents are already buying baby clothes and supplies for the couple. They are completely won over by the man. I think they're just blinded by the fact that their daughter finally has someone and will give them grandkids, which is a really sad thought. By this point, we've noticed her personality growing slightly more stressed and depressed as time goes on. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, oh, she's just another dumb girl who picked up a sleazeball guy who's milking her for all she's worth. And you're definitely not wrong. We all thought the same thing. Until one day, she dropped this little bomb on us. He has just recently told her that he used to be special ops in the military, the Air Force to be exact, and that they've decided they want him to work for them again. They'll pay him $75,000 for working 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. The story always changes, something she doesn't find suspicious at all. Testing military equipment that's too dangerous and could be life-threatening. He agrees to do the work, and we all think he's copping out of the relationship. She then tells us that if she wishes to remain in contact with him, they'll have to get married as soon as possible, and she'll have to be prepared to move away with him. She explains that the military has been calling her and making stops at their house to explain to her that she'll have to marry him immediately, and she needs to be prepared to move to an undisclosed location at any given moment. From that location, she'll not be allowed to make any contact with friends or family, since everything her husband will be doing is top secret, and she has to prove that she can be trusted. Obviously, all of us are now very alarmed. Well, everyone but her and her family. They are delighted that she's with a military man, and they're proud that she gets to be a part of something much bigger. The rest of us, sane people, are trying to figure out what on earth he could be plotting. Is she going to be hijacked into human trafficking? Is he going to murder her? One of our co-workers actually called the human trafficking hotline, and they think it's definitely something that they've seen before. Unfortunately, they can't do anything about it until he actually makes a move and takes her. We're looking into contacting our local police to see if there's anything that can be done about this before she gets the call that tells her when they have to make their move. I later found out that around this time, Jane and Miguel had had a secret wedding ceremony at her church and were now married. Oh yes, there was a certificate and everything. Full-blown, legally binding marriage. None of his friends or family were present, only Jane's family and their pastor. She hid it from the rest of us for about a week. During these days of us being in the dark, we noticed a lot of mood shifts with her. One day she would come in beaming and happy, and the world was perfect, and the next day we could see the stress and tell that something was wrong. A few of us also noted that at the same time, both Jane's and Miguel's Facebook accounts had been deleted. He had recently made an account, no pictures of him, and just pictures of all of the nice cars that were supposed to be his. He rarely used the account, and all of his family on the account looked nothing like him. We were afraid that he wasn't wanting her to give too much information about their situation, movements, and whereabouts when he finally kidnapped her. She confided in a coworker that he had had a lot of outbursts, and though he hadn't been violent, he had suddenly become a very different person. We tried warning her that he was dangerous, but she assured us that he was just insecure from having been cheated on so many times in the past, and that it was nothing. It was sad to say she was definitely in an abusive relationship. The saddest part is seeing a situation like this and knowing that they can only help themselves at this point when they refuse to listen to everyone else. It's worth mentioning that Jane also had a pet cat that she'd had for nearly 8 years up until that point. Miguel was always getting angry at the cat, accusing Jane of loving it more than him, and so on. Her cat likes to paw at its food bowl when you pour the food into it, and one day, as he was trying to feed it, she playfully pawed. He went into a rage, stating that the cat was trying to attack him, and as a punishment, it should go without food. For days, when Jane would come home from work, she would notice her cat getting more depressed, and it would cry a lot more. He would assure Jane that the cat is fine, I've fed it twice today. Don't feed it or it'll get fat. He was trying to starve and was probably abusing her poor cat, and she didn't see this as a sign to leave the asshole. Shortly after these incidents, Jane wound up incredibly sick and had to be rushed to the emergency room. She had a high fever, but that is the extent of what she told us at work. She didn't return for 3 days. We were terrified that he had tried to poison her or had done something to get rid of her. She didn't find it strange at all that he wasn't at work for the days she was sick at home. It was this time that word made it to our work that they had been married. She came back to work, seemed to be fine. Around this time, Miguel got a phone call from the military stating that he had to report to Fort Scott for top secret weapons testing, and shortly after this, they would have to prepare for their big move. I dare you to look up Fort Scott, Kansas, and see if that seems like the kind of place that would do super dangerous, top secret military weapons testing. I couldn't begin to tell you how many lies he's told that could easily be disproven by a simple Google search, but she never questioned him about any of it. Unfortunately for him, the family van of hers that he'd been driving had broken down on his way to the test site, and her father had to come and bring him home. And by pure luck, the military called soon afterwards and told him that the equipment he was testing had exploded and killed a few men, so he was so lucky not to have turned up that day. They changed his plans, and his next top secret mission would be in April, and it would be then that he and Jane would get to make their move. Now, with this said, I would like to point out that I do get along with Jane, and I do understand some of where she's coming from. I don't blame the rest of my coworkers for not liking her. Like I said, she's a little stuck up, and a few of us still agree that, as annoying as she can be, and despite how ridiculous we think she's all being, she still doesn't deserve to be murdered or trafficked or whatever could happen to her. So for those of us that cared, we were glad that we at least had until April to figure out what we could do. As it turns out, before they were married, Jane was surprisingly good at keeping to her beliefs. Miguel had to live with another man from Jane's church and not with hers, so as to keep their marriage bed sacred and to not be tempted. Miguel made it abundantly clear to Jane that he hated these arrangements and would try to start fights whenever it was made clear that he wasn't going to get laid anytime soon. A week or so after the van broke down, a letter arrived at the house of the man Miguel had been staying with. It was inquiring about why he had missed the court date for giving away his parental rights back to his wife. Fortunately, this man from the church actually had common sense, so he met up with one of Jane's sisters to discuss what to do. Despite all of her family fully loving and supporting the couple, one of her sisters was actually hesitant and showed some doubts. There's sign of intelligent life, after all. Jane's sister used this information to find Miguel's wife on Facebook and talk to her, while the church man ran a $30 background check on Miguel. Surprisingly, this one turned up nothing, just like the free one, so he had to shell out $200 for a real background check. That safely showed how much of what Miguel had said about himself was complete bullshit. Miguel had been married twice up till this point. He had 4 children with his first wife, and they both had given up custody of the kids, who were now living with Miguel's parents, the real reason that Jane was never going to meet his family. He had 1 kid with his most recent wife, and they had just gotten divorced. The divorce was finalized a few days before Miguel and Jane's wedding. Sadly, this is all the information that we coworkers were able to find out that turned up in the background check, and nobody has told us anything else. Jane's sister printed out copies of the marriage certificates, and they got the church together to show them to Jane. They were all able to convince her that Miguel was a lying scumbag and helped kick him out of the house. He denied all of it until he was hauled away to a psych ward for suicide watch that night. He was released a few days after, proving himself sane, apparently. Jane issued a no-contact order and has cut off all communication with him as she proceeds to get an annulment. Jane was devastated for about a week, but she's mostly over it now. Gee, it's almost as though she was only really in love with the thought of this man and the thought of his valor, and not himself. And the hardest part of the situation was dealing with the blow to her ego, knowing how ridiculous she'd been. Sadly, this didn't last very long, as she now boldly tells everybody the tale of how strong and brave she was for getting through all of this. She assures everyone that Miguel was a master con artist, and that he was able to fool everyone her family and church back her up in all of these claims. They even say that we were fooled. To this day, I don't think she's really learned anything of value from this situation. The only thing that Jane and her church really care about is that Miguel had lied about being married. To this day, I can't find out what his plans were once they disappeared in April. She is still holding no contact with him, so I cannot find out this information. Jane's just too distraught over the fact that he wasn't the 35-year-old virgin of her dreams to care about any danger she could have been in. I hope someday that changes. I'm unsure if it will ever be answered, whether this man is a murderer or a human trafficker or whatever. All we know for sure is that he's definitely a lazy bum, a deadbeat dad, and an abusive asshole. And stupid. Very, very stupid. We also believe that he genuinely believes all of his lies, since he was so insistent on all of them being true up until court time, so far as we could see. So, definitely thinking some kind of mental problems here. So, Miguel, suffice it to say, let's never meet again.
This happened to me back in 2007. I was 9 years old, and my brother was 14. My mum had sent us out of the house with about $30 to go see a movie and maybe get a bite to eat afterwards. After watching the movie, it was getting pretty dark, and I was ready to go home. My brother wanted to get something to eat first, and we agreed to walk to McDonald's, which was only a couple of blocks away from the movie theatre. On our way there, we were stopped and approached by a man. He had a friendly smile plastered on his face, and he was holding his child's hand. There didn't seem to be anything off about this man. He was just an average-looking guy, and seemed to be nothing more than a father having a day out with his son. "Do you two think you could give my son and I a hand real quick? We need help loading a mattress onto the back of our truck. The truck is just up the road." "Sorry, but we really don't have time," my brother said. It was at this time I noticed the little boy. He was about 8 years old and looked abnormally thin. He had a blank expression on his face and wore clothes that were much too big for him. I turned my attention to the man, who was now mumbling to my brother about how it would only take a few seconds. My brother kindly declined the offer. Being the helpful kid that I was, I joined in with the man and tried to persuade my brother that we should help them out. I turned to my brother, who was now staring down at the little boy. My brother had a disturbed expression on his face as he looked down at the child, and the child stared back at my brother blankly. I don't understand why my brother had that face. He grabbed my hand and said, "I think that my mum's over there." He pulled me, and we began walking away from the man. I didn't understand what was going on, and why my brother had lied to the man about our mother being over there. He didn't let go of my hand, and practically dragged me until we were a far enough distance away from the man and his son. I looked back at the man, and I could still see him holding his son's hand. Only now he wasn't smiling anymore. He had a look of fury on his face as he yanked the little boy by the arm and they walked away. I pulled away from my brother's grasp and bombarded him with questions. He shushed me, pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number, and began pacing around nervously while talking on the phone. I remember the police showing up, and my mum came soon after. She took me home, but my brother was left with the police. I asked my mother what was going on, and she said the police were questioning my brother because the man we had encountered was dangerous. That's all she told me, and I went to bed. By next morning I had almost completely forgotten about the incident, and things went back to normal. It wasn't until a few days ago that the memories flooded back into my mind, and I decided to call my now 22-year-old brother to get some answers. When I brought up the ordeal again with him, he finally gave me the information I wanted to know, and now that I know everything, I understand how terrifying our encounter with the man truly was. My brother told me that the man was constantly trying to convince us to come with him. He happened to look at the little boy. The little boy then looked at my brother, with his eyes filled with terror, and mouthed the words, "I'm not his son. Please help me." Then his expression went back to being completely blank, almost as if he'd never said anything at all. This is why he had become so freaked out and snatched me away. When he called the police, they hurried down and he described the man as best they could. They couldn't do much with the little information my brother had given, because we hadn't even seen the car where the man supposedly hid. My brother told me that a few weeks into the investigation, they had found the little boy who was with the man, dead. His body had been cruelly dumped in the woods. The cause of death? Malnutrition and dehydration. If my brother and I had gone with the sicko, we likely would have met the same fate. He obviously couldn't have kidnapped both of us on his own, as my brother was fairly strong. That meant he must have had partners who could have helped him snatch up unsuspecting kids. Unfortunately, they were never able to catch any of the sickos who did this to the child, but the man was definitely not his father. His real parents had been searching for their son for almost a month. They'd managed to kidnap him, and use him as their puppet, and try to kidnap other children. Every time I think about that boy, I feel a deep pity for him. He was only a year younger than I was at the time, and I can only imagine how terrible it must be to slowly starve to death. And to the disgusting bastards who starves and murders children, you better hope we never meet.
So this takes place when I was around 10. I live about a block away from a park. There's a path that leads through it and comes to a T. Left leads down to a lake, right leads across a wooden boardwalk, around a swampy area, and back to a main road. I was at this park one Saturday night with a friend, Charles, and he was about 13. It was probably midnight. Charles and I had just crossed the parking lot, and were walking through the baseball field that leads to the park when we hear a car pull up into the lot. We thought it was just a car full of stoners or something of the sort, and kept walking. The driver turned on his brights for a few seconds, and then someone rolled down a window. The people in the car began shouting at us, asking what we're doing, if we wanted to hang out with them and go to a party. We yelled, "No," and just kind of shrugged it off as the car was turned off. At this point, we're about 3/4 of the way across the field when we heard all 4 doors of the car slam shut, followed by some more indistinct shouting. Charles and I were a little freaked out, and I remember joking with him, saying things like, "Wouldn't it be crazy if they came after us?" The 4 from the car began crossing the field as well. We could hear them on the gravel of the baseball field. At this point, Charles and I were walking backwards to the park, watching the group. They kept shouting at us to wait up for them and that they just wanted to hang out with us. They all began jogging towards us. Now, this wasn't the first time I'd been in a situation like this, so I told Charles we needed to haul ass. So we did. We took off towards the T-junction, the forest surrounding us blocking more and more of the light. The group behind us, however, decided we couldn't just leave like that. So they chased us, and they were fast. As we reached the junction and took a right, we slowed down to cross the boardwalk quietly. When we got roughly halfway through it, the people behind us were at the junction. As it was dark and they couldn't hear or see us, they pulled the classic stop and split up. Except that didn't last very long. We broke free of the trees, and the moon provided just enough light for them to see us. A few shouts of, "Over here!" and all 4 of them were hustling after us. We took a right turn after the boardwalk to circle back to my house when we realized our pursuers were just about to finish crossing. The swampy area I mentioned earlier plays a part here. It's just off the right of the sidewalk we were on. Charles and I knew we couldn't outrun them if we just went straight, so we decided to dive off the path, in the bushes, trees, and murky swamp water. We ended up somewhere between knee and waist deep in muck, breathing heavily, covering our mouths and noses to try to be as quiet as possible. The group after us started pacing up and down the sidewalk, shouting for us, saying we could talk it out and that they were cool people and we could be friends. All the while, they began poking around in the bushes above us. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 minutes, I guess they got bored because they went back across the boardwalk. Charles and I waited a little longer, just to be sure, then crept out and started the jog back home. As we got onto the street I live off of, we noticed their car was still in the parking lot. Not wanting to risk another encounter, we took off running as fast as we could. After finally getting back to my house, we saw a car with its brights on, speeding down the street. Charles and I both took showers to clean off, and never spoke of it again.
I hail from a small, rural town in Ontario, about an hour from Ottawa. Nothing bad happens there. People don't even lock their car doors at night. I never really thought anything like this could ever happen to me. But then I guess it did. My friend Angie and I were out in Ottawa around early July, sort of near Canada Day if I recall correctly. We had been bar hopping and having fun exposing ourselves to city life, us being country bumpkins and all. Angie is drunk, and I am not, because I have to drive us home, as there's no Uber or taxi to bring us to our little town, and if they do, it's at least a $60 cab ride. Me being sober might have been what saved our lives. We decided we wanted to go and visit a club. We'd never been clubbing before, so we intended to Google a place and head to that location. Instead, we got lost. We're somewhere facing a bunch of duplex housing and a single hotel. It's not especially deserted, but out of the way from the neon lights, if you know what I mean. It's silent on this street. Empty. We decide to turn back and choose another club that's easier to find when we come across these tourists. One's male and one's female. They're holding a phone and a printed out page with some Airbnb directions, and they approach us, asking if we have our phones with us. Angie immediately obliges with them, whips out her phone, and the man explains that they're here on vacation but can't find their Airbnb, and they need to use our phone to call the renters so that he can figure out which house it is. This man's accent is German, possibly Scandinavian, definitely not French or Spanish. My friend is willing, but fortunately for her, she's used up all her minutes and can't call anyone. But she can call me, or we could plug the address into Google Maps and show them that way. Angie turns to me and I panic. This whole time I've been looking at the couple, and it's all too weird. How could you be vacationing in a foreign country in today's digital age and not have a phone plan? How could you not know where the address is if you've got a printed copy of the Airbnb in your hands and street signs everywhere? Why are they alone in this empty street past midnight, with an airport just 30 minutes away? If they called a cab to their destination, the cab driver would have dropped them off on their doorstep. So many questions are rising in my head, and I immediately are getting signs of red flags and anxious nauseousness. I make up this lie, that I only have my iPod and that I don't have data on it. Angie calls me out on it, but I shut her up and drag her away from the tourists and closer to the hub of downtown. Angie is asking why we didn't help them, and I run my thoughts by her. She looked at me and goes, "It's strange. I noticed they didn't have any luggage, but I didn't give it a second thought." Needless to say, it concluded our night.
Almost 12 years ago, I met a guy named Charlie online in a video game. We played together for a while, talked every day, eventually exchanged phone numbers, started texting, calling, and inevitably developing feelings for each other. I decide that I'm an adult-ish woman at the ripe age of 19, almost 20, and that I should make the 3,000-mile move to be with this guy. At this point, we had been talking for almost 2 years, and I felt confident in my choice. He promises me everything a girl could want in a relationship, and I fall for it, hook, line, and sinker. I arrive in a southern Texas town, and he picks me up from the airport, and we drive to his house. We planned that I would live in his grandmother's house, being as it was vacant and I could afford the rent. He said his grandmother had passed away, and it was something he had cleared with his aunt, and I was all good to move in. He originally told me he would move in with me too, which never happened. The first red flag should have been when he hid me in the house. He never got the permission for me to live there, and it turned out that the house was going to be sold in a few weeks. I ended up on the couch at his parents' house, whom he lived with. His family is really religious, and he didn't want to, quote, let them down by finding somewhere else for us. So I lived with them for a few months, paying rent by cooking and cleaning for this family. I get a part-time job later on working with Charlie at a major clothing retailer. I go to his church, fit in with his group of friends, and everything is great. His family likes me, and I'm really enjoying my time in Texas. The second red flag I missed was his hesitation to introduce me as his girlfriend. He would simply introduce me as his friend and tell people we were just friends. In private, though, it was the opposite. He would tell me he loved me, how much he cared for me, and that he couldn't wait for us to live together. Everyone knew Charlie and I were together, but he denied it. Hard. After about 6 months of this, I'm approached by some girl whose name I don't remember, and she basically tells me that I've stolen her man, and that one day some girl is going to weasel her way in like I did, and I will know her pain. And then she leaves, and I never see her again or anything. Fast forward about 2 or 3 years, and I'm finally catching on about his shit. I'm tired of being told in public I'm not his girlfriend, but in private how much he loves me. We are on and off again at this point, but we still have feelings for each other and decide to really give it another go. A new girl, Lucy, starts to work with us, and they become fast friends, her calling at all hours to complain about her jerk boyfriend. I instantly had a bad feeling about her. I hated her, but I tried so hard to like her and be friends. Inviting her for drinks, taking her to concerts, you name it, I tried it, against my better judgment. Her birthday comes up, and he takes her to lunch while I'm working, and I see this picture he posts of her on Facebook. And the look she's giving him, I just know he's screwing her. My heart sinks, so I confronted him, and he tells me that it's an unfair question to ask if he is sleeping with her. So I break up with him, but decide to stay friends. Biggest mistake of my life. So Lucy starts talking about Charlie and his skills in bed, bad-mouthing him, spreading rumors at work, just crazy stuff, and she blames all these rumors on me. Around this time, Charlie is also passed over for a promotion at work and makes an offhand comment about how he's going to shoot up the store because of this. Another red flag that I just totally missed. Charlie is let go and rumors run wild. I stay silent because of an investigation at work about the rumors and the comment Charlie made about shooting the place up, and I wanted no part of that mess. About a week, maybe 2 later, Charlie asked me to go to the movies with him, and I said I would go. He then kidnapped me, taking me into the back country, far, far away from anywhere, the middle of nowhere. He parks the car, and I feel super scared at this point. He hasn't said a word in over 30 minutes, and I don't have cell service. He pulls out a gun, cocks it, points it at me, and tells me to tell the truth or he will kill me. I start crying, telling him I have no idea what he's on about, and he pulls the trigger. It's empty. He cocks it again and points it again, telling me that I need to tell him the truth, that we are playing Russian roulette, and I would die if I kept lying. He did this 3 more times. Each time, the gun was empty. I'm in hysterics at this point. I can't breathe. I'm crying so hard. And then he tosses the gun in the back seat with a laugh and says, "I'm just playing with you. I wanted to see if you kept your story straight. I had to be sure who was lying to me. I'm so glad it's not you. You're a great friend." And he drives us back to town for the movie, talking the whole time like nothing was wrong. I am terrified still, and I know that I have to get away, so I excuse myself partway into the movie. I go into the restroom, call a friend to pick me up, and then I call the cops. When it was all said and done, they said they couldn't do anything to him because he never actually hurt me, and he didn't have the gun when they came to his house, and I had no proof anything had ever happened. I went into hiding and later found out that he had planned this entire thing out with Lucy, and that it was her way to get rid of me because she was jealous. He went on to date Lucy for a few more years. I've been in hiding from him for 5 years now, and eventually cut all contact with mutual friends when one of them was having lunch with me and told Charlie about it. I thankfully left before he was able to show up. He apparently wanted to talk to me. Charlie, I hope we never meet again.
My friends and I, of age 11 to 12, were on a housing development in Illinois, and this all happened during summer. My first summer in my new home, out in the sort of sticks. My friend from school and I loved to run around the neighborhood and into the forest behind the homes. While we're out, we noticed an ice cream truck kind of tracking us. It had its music running, so we sort of wrote it off and continued on our adventure. Every time we'd pop out of the woods again, the ice cream truck would never be too far behind. Same driver, same plate. We laughed and joked about it being some weird new business tactic to get kids to buy. However, we were broke, so we just kept playing. The stalking was incessant after a while. Every turn we'd make, no matter where we'd pop up, it would always be near. The driver always pretending not to see us, but keeping pace as we walked. Eventually it was time to go home, and so we did. When I returned home, I told my mother about the experience, and she called the police. After a bit of questioning, they decided I was just letting my imagination run wild, but they checked it out anyway. The initial search of the neighborhood churned up nothing but a single ice cream truck driven by a woman, ran by a reputable company. About a week later, they got a similar report by another girl in the neighborhood. They found the truck with the exact same guy, completely unlicensed, with a little boy unconscious and tied up in the back.
Back in the 90s, I was out with my friend in a neighborhood in rural New England. We were about 9 or 10. It was a town where you never had to worry about anything, and kids roamed wherever pretty freely. You know the type. This one day, we were out hanging around, roaming like we usually did, and we noticed this gray station wagon circling our road. It made a big loop, about a mile around. And cars going by in general is fairly uncommon, so seeing the same car several times was definitely weird. The first time we saw it, we were eating some snacks up on some rocks by the side of the street. We saw the car twice during that time and thought it was odd, but kept walking on our way. We were planning to go to her house, get our swimsuits, and then go to another neighbor's house for a swim. As we walked, we noticed the car a couple more times and got really panicked. The car slowed down a lot going by us, but nobody had said anything yet. We moved into the trees a bit, still walking along the road, but not right next to it anymore. We saw him coming around the bend as we neared some tall bushes and started to panic. He was now moving extremely slowly, and we could tell that he was looking at us. We went into these thick, thick bushes and paused on the other side of them. My heart nearly stopped. We could just make out through the other side that he pulled up the car right to the other side of the bushes and was reaching through them to try to find us. We held our breath until he slowly drove past, then sprinted into the thick forest. We walked home with some difficulty. We were so deep in the woods out of fear, and finally made it to her house. We never went swimming. On a separate day, I was hanging out with a different friend in my neighborhood, and, long story short, we saw the gray station wagon again. Several times it circled our neighborhood. We were with a bigger group this time, boys and girls, and we all eventually got the courage to walk to one of the boys' homes because their parents were home and we were super scared. But the scariest part of this memory is that my parents never believed me about it. I'll never forget how I was almost kidnapped, and my mom just didn't care. The police were called and we were interviewed several times, but nothing ever actually happened. No one was taken, but for a while, some people were understandably freaked out. So, guy in the gray station wagon, I hope you never met any kids. And to any adult who wouldn't believe their own child, I hope my kids don't meet you or my mom either. I have no relationship with her, and while this incident isn't 100% of the reason, it is certainly a portion of it.
This happened a long time ago, but is probably the scariest experience of my childhood. It was a summer day. Me and my friends were playing in the woods. We were both around age 10. And after walking a bit deeper into the woods, I noticed a man sitting on a stump. I instantly got a weird feeling from him. He was an older man and he had a long beard and was holding something in his hands, but I don't remember what it was. We weren't that close to him, but just looking at him, and I got a bit creeped out, and I whispered to my friend, "Don't say anything." But of course the first thing he does is yell at the man, "Hey!" The man turned his head quickly towards us. He stared at us for what seemed like an eternity, until he suddenly dropped whatever he was holding in his hands and began running towards us. Obviously we ran as well. We ran as quickly as we could, shouting for help along the way. When we finally got out of the forest and had some distance, I looked behind me, and the man was nowhere to be seen. We were around the ages of 10, and this was an old man chasing us through the woods. What he would have done, I have no idea. But to a kid, this is terrifying.
Hello everyone, I'm Raven, and I'd like to thank you for listening to tonight's video. I am excited and truly honored to have been chosen as one of the 4 contestants for this event. I'm grateful to Mort for selecting me and to each of you for listening. If you enjoyed tonight's video, you can show your support by giving a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing so you never miss an opportunity to let the darkness take control. Be sure to tick the bell when you do, that way you'll be sure to get your nightly notification. I'd also like to invite you over to my channel, Raven Reads. There you'll find content like tonight's video, as well as those featuring original stories, urban legends, most haunted places, and other horror-related topics. I'd love to see you there. Finally, if you'd like to see me back on this channel in the future, don't forget to vote for me in Saturday's poll. Many thanks in advance for those who do, and good luck to the rest of the contestants as well. Thanks again to Mort and to each one of you. Bye for now.